Welcome to Endurance Podcast. In this episode, we deep dive into the science around personalized nutrition. We have special guest and leading researcher in the field, Professor Gareth Wallis. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Endurance Podcast with myself, Alex Rhodes, and as always, my glamorous assistant, Dr. Tim Podlogar. How are we doing this morning, Tim?
Hey, Alex. Doing well. I did my bike session already, so feeling great for the podcast.
That's always a good start to the morning. But just on that, the listeners might have noticed that we didn't have a podcast, certainly in this format, for last month, because we were actually out at the Eurobike Expo in Frankfurt, which we did some amazing live talks. We had Chris Froome, Benji Nason, and yourself, Dr. Tim Podlogar, talking all about science, experience, and the world of cycling and performance nutrition. So if you haven't been and listened to those yet, head over to YouTube, to the Endurance channel. There's some great talks there, and they were kind of the first live shows that we did as well. So we're super excited about how those went. But for this podcast, we're going to bring you something a little bit more new, and we're going to do more of a deep dive into the science. So the aim is to look at maybe some of the latest trends, talk about the science behind it. More often than not, probably debunk some myths as well along the way. So hopefully if you as the listeners enjoy this this format, then we're going to bring more of this kind of stuff to you as well. And just to start off on that, today's topic, we're going to dive into personalized nutrition. And we've got a fantastic guest lined up for you today, who's got some great expertise and great knowledge around that subject. He's a professor at the University of Birmingham, and his field of research is around nutritional manipulation and the adaptive response to exercise. So we're going to have a great conversation, and hopefully Tim will give us an insight into how he's got to know this person as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Gareth Wallis. Good morning, Gareth.
Morning. Thanks for having me on this podcast.
You're absolutely welcome, and thank you for coming on as well. I know you work very much in this field, and it's going to be great to dig a little bit deeper into some of the work that yourself and Tim have been doing, but also some of the things that we're seeing out there in the field at the minute. And maybe we can either, debunk some of those things or help the listeners just understand what to perhaps listen to or think about in their own their training and nutritional practices. But just to start off with, if you're able to just give us a brief, because I'll probably butcher, a lot of the technical aspects of it. But if you just give us a brief in your background, where it kind of started and where you are now.
Absolutely. So as you said, currently I'm a professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK, professor of exercise, metabolism and nutrition. And my interests are very much in how does nutrition impact metabolic responses to exercise, primarily in the context of athletic performance. And as we'll see, I think as we go through the conversation, it's very dominated by carbohydrates as the nutritional macronutrient of choice. I've been here nearly 14 years. Started as a lecturer and kind of worked my way up. Prior to that, I worked in the food and drink industry, essentially in product development in sports nutrition. So sort of have some experience on that side of things. But before that, went through very much the traditional academic route, undergraduate sports science, MSc in exercise physiology. And I guess the thing that brought me to the carbohydrate world was the PhD I did, which was very much focused around carbohydrate feeding during exercise and trying to optimize carbohydrate blends to improve, I guess, the effectiveness of carbohydrate feeding. And so I was very closely involved with some of the early work around combining glucose and fructose during exercise, etc. So I think that area definitely developed my passion for this field, and I've kind of stayed with it ever since. So, nearly 20 years now of working in the carbohydrate field, and I've seen it go from being, the thing everybody's doing to the thing nobody's doing. And I guess now we're sort of seeing a bit of resurgence in interest in carbohydrates. So it's quite an exciting time to be part of it again.
Yeah, and I do want to get into, some of the details and some of the things that we are seeing out there at the minute, because like you say, it has gone pretty wild. And it'll be interesting in getting your perspective as well, because just like the previous live show that we did with Chris Froome, we were quite interested as well, because he's someone who's seen those trends over a long period of, of racing, where there's been the periods of low carb and high carb and where we're at now. So it's good to see, a perspective from out in the field, but also it's going to be nice now to see how that looks from a scientific perspective as well. But of course, you're, you mentioned you're passionate about what you do, and particularly carbohydrates. I think you have someone as equally as passionate about that on the screen as well. So, Tim, do you want to you guys know each other quite well. If you just want to let the listeners know how that has come about.
Yeah, I guess I got to know Gareth during my master's that I started in 2015. And then I started a PhD with him the year after. Then you moved after the PhD to Slovenia for a year and a half, I think. And then I got back as a postdoc for Gareth. And then, now I'm independent down south in Exeter, but still pretty much messaging with Gareth every single day.
Yeah, and that, that brings it together in the sense that you guys have been working on individualization of carbohydrates as well, and there's some recent work going on there, and I don't know who is probably best to give a brief on the current work that's going on before we start to talk about some other things. But what are you currently working on? I suppose we'll start with Tim, and you can join in, Gareth.
Yeah, no, actually, I already talked about the personalization the other day, so I will let Gareth, because he's, I think, better at wording than I am.
Yeah, no, thanks. As Tim said, we've been looking at personalization for a few years now. And I think I came to it because, we could see the nutrition field was more generically was moving in that direction. And it kind of made us think about, how can we, in what we do, approach that area, if you like. And we'll get into the details, but, we're very interested in measuring how much of a carbohydrate someone's actually using for energy. And started to think about whether actually there's a personal aspect to that, a unique aspect. And that led us on this sort of path towards, okay, can we use some of the expertise we've got to think about ways to optimize carbohydrate recommendations on a more individual level? So we've been working a lot on that for the last few years, I guess. But alongside that, the big project that Tim and I had worked on really for the last few years as well has actually been looking at how we metabolize carbohydrates in the heat, because we know that people are exercising more and more in hot conditions, and that might change things a bit. So we've been really trying to get under the skin of what happens in those conditions, and can we do anything to really try and optimize that. So that's probably for another podcast, but I think that's where our major effort has also been with to be honest, the personalization stuff has been more of a fun side project that we've been able to pursue whilst we've been doing other things.
Yeah. And just, I suppose, for the listeners out there, the term personalization, where are we coming from that? Are we saying that in the near future, individuals will be able to have, some kind of test, understand what, or, how much carbohydrates they're using during exercise, and therefore you can supplement with appropriate amounts? Is that what the direction we're heading?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's an acknowledgement that, we've known for many, many years that in certain situations in exercise, if the duration and intensity are long enough or hard enough, that carbohydrate feeding is beneficial for performance. Guidelines tend to be fairly broad and generic. And I think what a lot of people are doing is either, not following them or working out through trial and error what seems to work best. But it's not necessarily based on any, let's call it, physiological element. And so I think accepting that, we all have different physiologies means that actually we potentially could start to tailor carbohydrate ingestion rates based on your own ability to, take in and metabolize that carbohydrate. And so whether that's a test or whether that's, trying to come up with some sort of algorithm that helps to predict those things, but certainly that's the direction of travel. And we're coming from a very lab science background, so we would always say, well, actually the best thing is to test this, and where that's possible, that's certainly something that can be done, and I think that's, for those who are really interested in it, that's probably the best opportunity in the short term, at least.
Yeah, because we as you mentioned earlier, we're seeing this explosion of people taking more and more carbohydrates, and there are some elite athletes out there that we've seen in the recent past where we've been very much upwards of 120 grams per hour, 140, even Camworth, I can't remember what Ironman it was, doing 200. Why do you think that we're kind of just seeing this? Do we think it's just an extrapolation of the science? Is there some logic behind this?
Yeah, I can try to reply to this one. I think it all comes back to a few years ago when kind of for the first time, manufacturers started to use fructose along the whole product line, so 2-to-1 ratio, and then later 1-to-0.8 ratio, and suddenly athletes felt just fine by having large amount of carbohydrates, and there also soon after the evidence started to emerge that you can improve recovery by perhaps going above 90 grams per hour. Then at some point we published a study compared 90 versus 120, and actually figured out or showed that 120 yields higher oxidation rates of ingested carbohydrates. So we can actually use more than what's kind of recommended. And then people were just trying to push these limits by training the gut, to training the tolerance and increasing the amounts of carbohydrates during exercise, thinking that more carbohydrates means better performance. And since then, people were just pushing this number up and up and up. But interestingly, there is not a lot of evidence to suggest that this actually improves performance during exercise. And yeah, we only have limited evidence for the recovery. So we are still kind of very early in this field. And one of the problems I see with this pushing really high amounts is that when you look at the old studies, and one of those is actually from Gareth's PhD time, is that even it perhaps sometimes goes too high, you actually increase the use of glycogen, something that perhaps Gareth can say a bit more about. But so there is not no relationship between more the better. I think it's rather individualized, and this is kind of where we stop, what's the optimal, and this is probably where we started thinking about, perhaps we can personalize it and find what actually people can oxidize and just provide that to the athletes, and then we can basically provide people with like dose that it actually, from the physiological perspective, actually makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that you mentioned that, and you mentioned the study that I believe you did, and it might not be 100% accurate, but the more carbohydrates that you were taking, you saw a higher proportion of oxidized, even though it was a smaller overall percentage. So then, the logic would say, well, if I take more, I'm just going to oxidize more. But, maybe Gareth can jump in on what, on the back of Tim's there, could we see some negative consequences from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there is always the potential for overdosing, if you like, and that, could result in, gastrointestinal distress. So there's a risk there. Even where people are able to tolerate very large amounts. As Tim said, we don't fully know what's really happening metabolically, but in some situations, very high amounts of carbohydrate seems to almost have the opposite effect on the use of your existing glycogen stores. So usually we're trying to preserve these, but there can sometimes be a paradoxical increased use of the existing glycogen stores with overdosing of carbohydrate. And that's been seen in 2 or 3 studies. So whether there's a performance consequence of that, we don't know, but it's a risk. So I think it comes back to, trying to find the sweet spot. So I think we certainly know now, there's been a huge paradigm shift from, I guess, the 90s, where we would say up to 60 grams an hour. Then there's been this revolution, if you like, really driven by the work of Asker Jürkendrup looking at glucose fructose, and that really pushed that upper limit to 90 grams per hour, which was probably still like a practical dose, where, the evidence always suggested oxidation rates could be pushed higher with higher doses. But the 90, I think, from a recommendation perspective, became more of a nice sort of pragmatic balance of what you can take and what's useful. It is clear now that people can use more and they can ingest more, but where that exact limit is probably quite variable. And I think it speaks to that kind of need to understand your own metabolism, because it could well be that, and I think there's a very interesting situation where people are consuming large amounts where they might not be oxidizing that. They may not have any negative gastrointestinal symptoms, but one has to question, well, what is it doing if it's not being used, and why would you do that? And I think that, sometimes we find the athletes are often ahead of the scientists. And maybe there is something in it that we're still waiting to discover. And I think that's what makes it quite interesting at the moment, and why this debate is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think my question on from that actually was going to be around, I've lived through that period as well as being in cycling, where it went up from kind of that recommended 60 grams an hour, and we've increased, and general is between 60 and 90 now for extended bouts of exercise or intensity. And came with that was, we need to train the gut and to be able to utilize that, or to be able to consume that amount. But do we really know that we are oxidizing that amount, or are we just becoming more tolerant to it? Is it still there? There's not really much more going on. We're just be able to, take more on, like the food eating competition. Those guys can eat an enormous amount and be okay. Are we seeing that?
Yeah, and I think Tim could jump in on this. I think we share similar. I hope we share similar views, but it's always fun it's actually more fun when we don't, because then we get to have a proper discussion. So I think there's a number of ways to look at it. I absolutely think that some people are training themselves to be more tolerant of higher doses. And for some individuals, that may actually get them from a point where they weren't consuming enough to get the maximum benefits, to where they're actually now oxidizing as much as they can. And that's probably a good thing. It avoids the underfueling as long as there's no GI distress. There's probably also some people that are extremely tolerant to consuming large amounts. And in doing that, they're probably also oxidizing as much as they possibly can, which is good, but they're probably not oxidizing all of what's being ingested. And I suspect that some of it is residing in the stomach and the GI tract in general. Some may be also getting in, but just not being used. Maybe because the demand isn't there. It may be stored in non-exercising tissues, etc. So whether that is good or bad, I don't know if we fully understand. And that's really, I think, where we're at the moment, is trying to work out, what's the trade-off here between tolerance, absorption, and oxidation. And I think that's quite an interesting, debate, to the point where you don't have any GI distress. You could almost say, well, it's fine. But is it fine? That's you could also argue it's an inefficient use of the fuel, because you're not using it, and there's no need to take on more than you need.
Yeah, and the big question is, Tim, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, definitely.
No, we're not going to the debate yet. Maybe there's some questions down the line. But an interesting conversation, actually, that kind of made me just think then when what you were saying, that we had that conversation out at Eurobike, Tim, where whether there's even a potential to resynthesize glycogen whilst exercising at much higher amounts. I guess we perhaps don't understand that, but that could have some practical, whether it's implications or benefits for stage type racing or long duration events. Do you have any more thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, like for triathlon, I don't think that's likely, because the power is kind of like constant all the time, and you never really rest, so you keep pushing. Whereas in cycling, on those like mountainous stages, especially in amateurs, when the descents are way slower, this could actually happen. The question is actually like, how much is it going to glycogen? Is it like really like worthwhile? And like all these kind of things that are kind of not really well understood at the moment, especially like regarding the intensity. On the climb, you're probably pushing really hard, and usually the absorption or the use of like exogenous or ingested carbohydrates, it kind of declines. So actually you would expect the same amount of carbohydrates if you're fueling at the same rate would then become available for descent. There are like so many unknowns here. But definitely there is some speculations that can be made about resynthesizing glycogen during exercise.
Okay. And just going back to your previous point, Gareth, around oxidation and absorption, can we measure those in the lab, and is that where the direction is going? In particular, I think we're perhaps more familiar of just general carbohydrate oxidation, but exogenous oxidation of carbohydrates, and whether that's just fructose or glucose. And can we also measure absorption as well, so that we can understand what is actually going in and what are we using?
Yeah, it's good question. So I'll start with absorption. So it is possible to measure absorption. It's not that commonly done. If you want to directly measure absorption, you can put tubes down people's throats or noses and into their intestine and start looking at actually what's really getting through from the outside world into the body at the intestinal level. That's really not very commonly done because it's quite invasive. And you could...
I can't imagine too many athletes coming in and going, yeah, I want to know this.
And there's some limitations because you're often just measuring absorption across quite a small part of the intestine, and of course the intestine's very large. So what we've often done is is measured this thing called exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, which in simple terms is like the end point of everything. So you've eaten something, it's been absorbed, it's gone into the body, it's gone to the muscles, it's been burnt for energy, carbon dioxide is produced, and you breathe that out, and we can actually measure that, and that's what, kind of gives you that measurement. And the way we do this is we use little stable isotopes of carbohydrate, so they're slightly heavier than normal carbohydrates, still very, very safe, they're not radioactive, that's important to point out. But what they allow you to do is essentially trace the carbohydrate that you ingest through the body and then out into the breath. So when we can capture that heavy carbohydrate or carbon dioxide that's come out, we know that that's come from the drink or the gel that we've given. And that way we use that to quantify exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. As I say, that's kind of an end point measurement of the whole process. It doesn't tell you directly anything about absorption, but it tells you, I guess, the sort of functionally relevant outcome, which is it used for energy? And often that's kind of used as a surrogate for carbohydrate availability, although it's probably not as direct as we might like from an absorption perspective.
Yeah, and I guess that is, like you mentioned, we're really getting into the personal aspects there, where we can look at individual responses to this and what what people are really doing. Is this protocol? First of all, what is the protocol? Do we understand different intensities? Is it a kind of a standard graded exercise test? And can we start to look at, do we think that glucose and fructose might have different oxidation ratios, and therefore, like that standard 1 to 0.8 ratio then might change for people?
I think it's important to emphasize actually the benefit of using, for example, the stable isotope approach is that it can be completely non-invasive, which makes it quite amenable for testing people without having to take things like blood samples and all that sort of stuff. So you can just have a drink, and the only thing we're really doing is asking people to exercise and collecting their breath. And we would use standard indirect calorimetry, so a normal metabolic cart that a lot of labs have to measure carbohydrate and fat oxidation. And then we would also collect some breath to measure the 13C content, but it's all non-invasive, so it does make it quite amenable for use in whether it's professionals or serious amateurs. This is I guess this approach has been used in research for decades, so it's not new. It's been the domain of researchers trying to tease out how do things like intensity or duration or type of carbohydrate affect oxidation rates. I think what we've done in the last few years is try and take this research approach a bit closer to the everyday world approach, where actually a consumer might be able to actually partake in that type of experience to then understand their own individual oxidation rates to help inform their own nutritional programming. But that's been quite a journey, and we published some work on it earlier this year as kind of documenting part of that journey, and I guess the direction of travel for the sort of personalization process. So I'll kind of stop there and see if there's anything you want to go off, and maybe Tim can jump in as well.
No, I mean, you've both been working, in the lab. I suppose for the listeners out there, in this, this is the future of personalization there. What does that look like for the athletes? And, what's the lab like? If they said, I want to know a bit more about my, my metabolism, I want to book in, how does that process work?
Yeah, so, and we've been doing this with a number of athletes. So what we would usually do is obviously understand what the sport is, running, what's the preferred mode, if you like, of exercise, and invite people in. The test is pretty straightforward, actually. We ask people to exercise on a treadmill or a bicycle ergometer for 2.5 hours at fairly steady intensities. So we're talking 95% of LT1. And that's really so that everything's nice and stable, so that our measurements are accurate. During that exercise bout, we would provide them with carbohydrate drinks, a glucose-based drink, which has a very small amount of stable isotope tracer in, which allows us to trace its metabolism. They'll have that routinely during the exercise. We will collect their expired breath, be able to determine then how much carbohydrate they're using in total, but importantly, how much of the ingested carbohydrate they're using. When we know that, what we're doing in those tests are actually feeding more than they need, because we want to be sure that we're maximizing their system. What our research has shown is that if we understand what their sort of highest oxidation rate is, we can then use that to predict the dose of carbohydrate they need to actually achieve their peak oxidation rates. So we would then be able to say, well, if you're oxidizing this much, this is the amount of carbohydrate you need to consume to be able to achieve those oxidation rates. And then it would be very much a conversation around, how you might achieve that, what type of product strategies will allow you to achieve that. What are you currently doing? Because if it's a long way away, then it might be quite silly to suddenly double your intake. But what it does, it tells you something about what might be possible. And then you can go away and think about, well, how can I gradually increase to reach what could be my potential here? And so that's how we've been approaching these things. So we do think it provides that, unique value that allows people then to work towards, or actually in some cases maybe they have to pull back because they've been consuming too much.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you translated that to the applied side and looked a bit more holistically, and having that kind of that coach's mind is like, how, okay, we've got this, and now how are we going to apply this logistically and practically. So it's really interesting that you then take that and move it forwards and look at how to use that out in the field. I know Tim has been doing some of that work in the lab, or certainly I've seen him doing some of that work. Maybe he has a bit more insight on this. And just, the people that you've worked with so far, and look at this, do you find any influential factors, or, do you find it's quite the same for certain types of individuals? Does it change depending on their fitness level? As you mentioned right at the start, heat, altitude.
Yeah, like if we disregard the environmental conditions, I feel like it's the numbers we're seeing, or I'm seeing in the lab, are all over the place. So there is no real big relationship between body size, body mass, fitness level, like the duration of the training volume and the amount of carbohydrate they have in the diet, on basically the ability to oxidize ingested glucose. Perhaps the sample size I have is too small. There is some relationship that's been kind of between body size and ingested oxidation rate that has been published in one of the studies that we also collaborated on. But the more data I get, I don't really see that, like that, to be able to say, okay, you're 1.90 meters, you have 90 kilos, you should be eating this much. Perhaps there is a highly chance that this person will be able to oxidize more than somebody that's like 1.60 meters and has 50 kilos. But actually, in an odd case, it can actually happen that these two people would have exactly the same oxidation rates. So you can't really guess without actually testing the person. And that's kind of like the beauty or the problem of it. And that's why kind of like for elite athletes, in my opinion, it makes a lot of sense to actually test, not guess.
Yeah, and that's that individual response then. Have you, depended on the population that you've worked with, have you seen differences in, I suppose, fitness levels, from the elite side to perhaps not the general public or the well-trained? Is there any associations there with higher intakes or higher oxidation rate?
Not really. I haven't seen that. I think most athletes that come in, or even amateurs, they usually are on a high carbohydrate diet. So they're basically exposed to high amount of carbohydrates anyway on a daily basis, because as soon as you train, you then basically need to eat quite a bit of carbohydrate. So I haven't really tested anyone on a low carbohydrate diet where perhaps the oxidation rates could be a bit lower, but here, even when I tested professional athletes, I never saw they would be able to oxidize way more than less trained people.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that then highlights, it really does highlight that individual response to it. And I suppose looking beyond that as well, because you've mentioned there, I know this is very new, in the field of research, but currently we've got to come into the lab to do it. Do we ever see a time where this can be conducted in the field? Do we see some inclination where we actually need to test this in the lab before we move it out there? What's kind of the future view on it? Either of you can answer that one.
I mean, I think that one day there may be the potential to be out doing things in the field, but there's quite a lot of, I would say, technical challenges that we would need to overcome to be absolutely sure that the numbers we get really reflect what's actually happening. And so the lab is quite a nice environment for having control, which is, of course, the scientists we like to have. But I think, some of the challenges around controlling the intensity of exercise in field situations present some problems for the methodology, and then can essentially lead to numbers that might seem plausible but are inaccurate. And that has the potential to be quite problematic, because you could end up giving some advice based on numbers that weren't correct in the first place, and that could end up with quite catastrophic consequences. So what I could potentially see is a translation to field settings where those settings can be as controllable as is possible. So almost mimic lab, but in a field setting. And if you can get to that, then there's potential. But I do think that one, I guess, concern is that sometimes we try to move these things too quickly, and we haven't really thought through all of the eventualities. Whereas we've started in the lab, and this has been years in the making. It's not an overnight discovery, and I think that translation equally requires that kind of concerted effort to really think, how can we do this? We certainly know we can translate this into other people's labs. Yeah, so not everybody has to come to one place to do this thing, and it could be in other people's labs. But if you're talking genuinely about, outside in the field, I do think there needs to be quite a bit of validation research on that before we can be really, really sure.
I think that is a good message, because we are living in a world of wearables and, some dilemmas with what information those are giving out. So I think that's a good message to be, cautious and allow the research to take place for the listeners out there before it really moves to field testing. Just to kind of round up on that and the process, I suppose just a brief, if either of you are able to jump in on this, at what what are the benefits of this for the general cyclist, even the competitive cyclist, right up to the elite level? What are the benefits from doing this that we can currently see?
Yeah, if I may, I think the most important thing is for the athlete to have and a coach to have a peace of mind that what they're doing actually makes sense, and they're not overfueling or underfueling for the important events. So, for instance, when it comes to triathlon, you have one event in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks time. It's only that event, so you want to maximize the carbohydrate availability. So you do a proper glycogen loading and you do the optimal amount during exercise on the bike and on the run. And knowing the number makes a lot of sense. You might actually prevent some of the GI issues on the run, because after perhaps overconsumption of carbohydrates on the bike, you might actually end up having problems on the run. So I think this can kind of have profound benefits in that regard when it comes to cycling. And especially stage races, again, for hard days, what to fuel the riders to basically get the most out of to maximize the carbohydrate availability. But what I also kind of find working with riders on grand tours is that we are really obsessed about the energy availability and energy balance, because you have a 3-week long race and the stages are actually not super long. They can be 3-4 hours long, and you don't want to overfuel them. So by knowing what the maximal dose is, you basically have a budget to also maximize the replenishment of glycogen after exercise, because basically this is the fuel for the next day. Whereas if you overfuel during exercise and you just go through more carbohydrates than what's needed, you might in the long term either be in an energy surplus or be suboptimally prepared for the next stage because you just basically overfueled. And I leave this as a question. We don't really know what happens to the carbohydrates if you overfeed during exercise at this stage. Does this go to glycogen or not? That's a question. But what we kind of saw with 90 versus 120 study was that people tended to use more carbohydrates in general without sparing glycogen, meaning that perhaps, there was no benefit of going super high. So I think it's a kind of a peace of mind and gives reassurance to the practitioners of what they're doing actually makes sense. And you can then, based on the context you're working in, really nail down the protocol.
So, so it really, I've not coined this term, but, it comes down to testing, not guessing, when it comes to it. Are we seeing, are we currently seeing anything else out there in the field that are trying to approach this and understand this? Are some practices not really working for athletes? Are we seeing any of that at the minute?
I think, Tim, this is your domain.
Yeah, it's kind of among elite athletes, it's always go higher, use more, and it just sometimes or very often doesn't make sense, especially because then it's in Grand Tour, we're recording this during the Tour de France, and it actually happens that riders overeat during the stages and then basically end up having no dinner. I think that's kind of the problem, because they go just super high. And then in terms of different practices, people, there are claims that people can oxidize way more, but then there are methodological issues behind those tests. And again, that becomes a bit of a problem. So it's a lot of misinformation out there.
So it's, just like the world of nutrition in general, it is quite a difficult world to navigate out in social media, and perhaps even looking at what the elites are doing and the professional athletes is not necessarily right for everyone or even valid in some way. So that was quite an important part of doing this kind of podcast and getting you guys together, is to actually be able to talk about that and I suppose debunk some of those things that we're perhaps seeing out there, and talk about what we actually know currently. So that's I think that's a really important aspect for the listeners. I just want to kind of finish off because it's been fantastic having you on, Gareth, and I'm sure we could talk about a lot more things for a lot longer. But I'm aware, that we've got to stop on time for this. I've got a question for you both, actually, which you might have different views on this from where your field of expertise are and where you've been working most. But imagine, what we've spoke about today is really the future of personalized or individual nutrition that we are starting to see go out there a little bit and work with some athletes. Where do we kind of see this maybe 10 years from now, not only from a research perspective, but let's say, a cycling team that doesn't have any budget, how do we feel like we might inform fueling protocols or nutrition within that environment?
You want to start, Gareth?
Who wants to go first on that one? That might be a tough one. Sorry.
I think we clearly have, I guess, guidelines that are out there, and for many people, they'll be sufficient. They'll find these are quite broad ranges, and people will find their place in that. I think where you are looking for that level of individualization, either because you're interested or because you're actually having problems with either underfueling or overfueling, the testing becomes really important. I think what we can foresee now, I was, I guess, suggesting we need caution as we try and move into field settings, but I do believe that that's possible. And I also believe that, we could envisage a time where, even kind of home-based testing might be possible as well, which would definitely make it much more accessible to teams, in their own environment to get together and actually work some of these things out. So I do think that, rather like the way, if you wanted your blood glucose measured 20 years ago, you had to go to the doctors and have a blood sample, and now you can get a CGM. Yeah, so I can definitely envision a movement in that direction as the technology allows, I guess, the scale to be achieved in these types of areas. So I can see that, and I can see it being much more accessible. The key thing to that will be whether, we're in this early stage of talking about personalization, whether people truly find this to be useful and beneficial. Because we've seen in many areas of nutrition where you can personalize something, but whether you should, and whether it's actually providing you any extra benefit, isn't always the case. And I think time tells in a lot of the technologies that come and go. Some of them stay, some of them go. And I suspect that this buzz around individualization, personalization, and opportunities to get to that. If consumers and athletes find it beneficial, these things will stick. And if they don't, then something else will come into the fold.
And do you feel anything different, Tim? How would you, certainly working with some of the cycling teams that you have, how do you feel that the future of this might progress?
Yeah, because in professional cycling, like, everyone is obsessed about marginal gains and how they can get more information and be ahead of the competition. And over the years, we've seen everything from measuring non-invasively glycogen in the muscle to measuring blood glucose concentrations. We are talking about the sweat tests, many different kinds of ways of to get the information from the riders. And what we keep coming back to is how actionable this data that we gather actually yeah, is so basically, in other words, like what can we do once we see the number? And very often, like without even questioning the validity of these approaches, you actually figure out that like you're very often testing for the sake of testing, because you just like people like numbers, and then in the end of the day you might actually get lost in all the numbers you're dealing with. Take for instance, like be measuring core body temperature during races. You can't really do much when you're in the middle of the race. You can't stop and ask for more ice, because you're basically doing what you can. So it's not very actionable. Whereas on the other hand, when it comes to carbohydrates, you basically can take an action. Oh, this is a personalized dose. This is the amount we're having. And then we probably will be seeing even like personalization in regards to the environmental conditions, because it might be that like different conditions require different amounts. It might be that descents are treated differently than or like hilly stages than flat stages. But this is something that we will probably need to work more closely with the industry and then people in the field to better understand it. But I clearly, as a practitioner, I clearly see a potential in this to basically inform the practice.
Nice. And I think that we are advancing so fast in this world that I think that we will. It will just continue. But thank you for. Sadly, we've got to close the conversation there, and it has been fantastic. It is. I think for some of the listeners out there, there's some real insights into the future of nutrition, perhaps some things to look out for there. And thank you ever so much for your time, Gareth. It's really valuable to us just to get a view from inside the research as well, and to understand this a little bit more. So I hope the listeners have taken some real value and some interest on this topic and this deep dive into the world of nutritional personalization. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me. It's been nice to talk about this stuff with someone else other than just Tim for once.
And you are always welcome on anytime. I'm sure we can create many more topics that we can talk about. So thank you for those who listened to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.